Okay, so the 1960s and 70s, there's a lot going on in the 1960s and 70s. We're still in the Cold War. Kennedy is president. Kennedy was elected president in the election of 1960. And so he's president overseeing a lot of things domestically, so stuff happening in the United States and stuff happening abroad. So in 1962, we have what they call the 13 days. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the closest we came to nuclear war with the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And so we were spying on Cuba. And so these are the pictures that our spy planes took, and where we saw that they were preparing for nuclear weapons. And Kennedy contacts Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union. He's like, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, you've got missiles in Turkey, which is right at our back door, so we can have missiles in your back door. And so the problem with that is Cuba is right, here's a map, Cuba is right off the coast of Florida. So if they were to launch missiles, they could hit all these major cities. And so we really needed to do something about it. So it took about 13 days for them to come to this agreement to remove the missiles from Cuba, and we would remove the stuff from Turkey, so that, kind of like we're not going to have it there, you're not going to have it there, so we won't fight each other. JFK was assassinated in 1963. He was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald while he was riding in a parade. So this is Lee Harvey Oswald, and in Dallas, Texas. And this guy right here, Jack Ruby, this is the picture. He walked up to Oswald and shot him while he was in police custody. And we don't really know all the ins and outs, why or anything like that. Oswald is thought to have been a Soviet sympathizer, or he liked the Soviet Union. But he also said something along the lines of, I was set up, I was framed. So there's a lot of weird stuff, which is why there's so many conspiracies about Kennedy's assassination. The Warren Commission, which was led by Chief Justice Warren, oversaw the investigation into his assassination, and the Vice President, Lyndon B. Johnson, became president. So a lot of the domestic stuff that's happening is related to civil rights. So Freedom Riders were a group of both white and black protesters that traveled from all these cities. They stopped at Greensboro, Birmingham, Montgomery, Jackson. These are all cities that had significant civil rights issues happening in this time period. So they got on a Greyhound bus and traveled to these different cities in protest, because again, Jim Crow laws said blacks and whites couldn't be on the same ride in the same bus together. They couldn't be friends. They couldn't do all these things. And so this was their way of protesting Jim Crow laws and for rights for African Americans. And so when they got to Birmingham, they were met by Violent Bob, and they were beaten. And their bus was set on fire, and so they had to bring another bus in, and they actually had to have federal marshals escort them out of the state. So some of Dr. King's friends were a little bit leaning toward communism, or thought to be leaning towards communism, which was really kind of scary, because again, we're fighting against communism, and Dr. King has such a huge following that people were afraid that he would start encouraging communism. So they did wiretap Dr. King. So they allude to some of the things that they heard while in the movie Selma. If you've not watched it, it's really good, about Dr. King. James Meredith, this is James Meredith. He was accepted into the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss, in 1962, and he had to be escorted in with 3,400 troops to protect him, because people were protesting. On June 11th, 1963, JFK called for civil rights legislation on national television. On that same day, a civil rights worker that was in Jackson, Mississippi, named Medgar Evers, this is Medgar Evers right here, was assassinated by a Klansman named Byron D. LeBeckwith, this guy right here, and he got away with it. He got away with it for almost 30 years, but he made the mistake of bragging at a Klan rally years later, about over 20 years later, about how he had killed Medgar Evers and got away with it. So they reopened the case, and it was retried, and they had to exhume his body, and so that's what this picture is. Medgar Evers was perfectly preserved. The medical experts had no explanation why his body looked almost identical as to when it went in the ground almost 30 years before. But they were able to get forensic evidence and things like that and run tests that we did not have the capabilities of doing in the 1960s that we now had in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So he finally did get justice. It took almost 30 years, but Byron D. LeBeck was finally convicted for the assassination of Medgar Evers. Dr. King's March on Washington happened this same time later this summer, and over 200,000 people witnessed his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. in front of the Washington Mall. 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was in September of 1963. 4 little girls lost their lives, and what was happening that day was a children's service, so the children were actually singing and kind of leading service. And Addie Mae Collins, her sister, was actually also in the area. She did not die, but she did lose an eye from the explosion. 4 Klansmen called the Cahaba Valley Boys were supposedly were convicted for the bombing, and they were able to convict 3, but 1 died before he could actually see any kind of justice, unfortunately. And Dr. King did speak at the funeral for 3 of the girls, Addie Mae, Carol, and Cynthia, because they all attended 16th Street Baptist Church, but Denise McNair did not. She went to a different church. She was just there visiting. The 24th Amendment was passed in 1964, abolishing poll taxes, meaning you don't have to pay anything to vote. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, outlawing any kind of literacy test or anything like that, requiring you to be able to read or write to be able to vote. And this is after you have the march from Selma to Montgomery, and where protesters were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In 1965, you have a riot that breaks out due to police brutality, and the Watts area was a predominantly African American area or community in Los Angeles, and it changed the civil rights movement from more of a peaceful movement to more a militant movement. Malcolm X was a militant leader of the civil rights movement. He wanted equality, but he did not want integration. So where Dr. King wanted equality and integration, Malcolm X wanted equality and segregation. He wanted the races to not mix. He was part of the Nation of Islam. His name was actually Malcolm Little. He went to prison, and while he was in prison, he converted to the Islamic faith and changed his name because he said Malcolm Little was my slave name, and so he did change that. And Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, on a hotel balcony. So here in 1968. LBJ had his domestic policy called the Great Society, and it was designed to fight poverty. And so a lot of things that we have today got started: Medicare, Medicaid, some different environmental things got started under this. PBS was also started. So a lot of changes domestically under the Great Society. We do get involved in Vietnam. Now, mind you, we did not go in guns blazing, which is what the consensus is about Vietnam. In 1960, Vietnam, because the Vietnam War really started in like 1954, and in 1960, we sent military advisors in to kind of help the South Vietnamese, because just like North Korea and South Korea, North Vietnam was communist, South Vietnam was not, and did not want to become communist. And so we sent military advisors to help the South Vietnamese, but that did not work, unfortunately, because the North Vietnamese were relentless. And so we do send our first troops in the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, and we use very different technology. So we now use chemical warfare. Helicopters were a major thing, things like napalm. So it was a very, very different war. It's very brutal, violent war. We Were Soldiers was a really good movie about this, and it talks about the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, which was led by Hal Moore, who was an Auburn graduate. And again, we continue to fight because of the things like the domino theory, and people didn't understand what we were fighting. They didn't understand, how bad communism was. And there were a lot of widespread protests protesting the Vietnam War. Music was written, so like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival, Give Me Shelter by the Rolling Stone, What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, A War by Edwin Starr, and Ohio by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. These are all songs that were written protesting the Vietnam War. There were others, but these were some of the most prominent. Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the CIA to spy on anti-war activists, and the FBI was instructed to disrupt their activities. A lot of cultural changes. We have this free speech movement that takes place at the University of California in Berkeley. And now we have hippies and rock and roll and drugs, and we have the feminist movement. Again, it started with things like the feminine mystique, and it's going to continue on into the 1960s and 70s. We now have oral birth control, where women did not have this prior to this time period. And we have the ultimate kind of celebration of this generation, which was Woodstock in the summer of 1969. They expected just a few thousand people to show up, and about 500,000 people showed up. So the Vietnam War takes place. We get involved in 1965, and we stay involved. We pull out of Vietnam finally in 1975. So we're involved in Vietnam for about 10 years. And so the Vietnamization means we were trying to start withdrawing troops. We were realizing we were losing soldiers. We were throwing lots of money at this, and this was not working. So we were starting the process of pulling out of Vietnam, but not leaving them completely, but realizing we've got to let them fight this fight on their own. And so the Nixon Doctrine said from now on, we'll send money to countries, which is kind of like what we've done with Ukraine. We send you money, we're not sending you troops. And that's because we don't want to get ourselves embroiled in another conflict that we have mass casualties and things like that, like Vietnam. Kent State, there was a student protest at Kent State University in Ohio, and the protest turned violent, unfortunately, and National Guard were called in, and 4 students lost their lives. The 26th Amendment was passed, and it lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. So if you can be drafted and go to war at 18, you should be able to vote. So that's the 26th Amendment. And the Pentagon Papers were classified documents that were leaked to the newspapers, basically saying, other things are happening in Vietnam that basically the government's been lying to us, is what the Pentagon Papers did. And everybody was outraged that we'd been lied to. A lot of court cases are heard in this time period, and so the two that are, two are really big, like the Miranda rights. If you see them on television, they come out of 2 court cases. They come out of Gideon versus Wainwright, and they come out of Miranda versus Arizona. So Gideon was a little old man that tried to defend himself in court, but because he couldn't afford an attorney, and he failed miserably at it, unfortunately. And Miranda versus Arizona was a guy that had abducted a woman, and when he gets arrested, he just basically says, yep, I did it, and spills his guts. Well, he didn't realize that he had the right to not tell on himself or not self-incriminate, which is the 5th Amendment. So Gideon versus Wainwright these are part of the 5th, 6th, 7th amendments to the Constitution that are covered. So that's what the Miranda rights are. So when they say you have the right to remain silent, that's Miranda versus Arizona. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you. Do you understand these rights as they've been read to you? So you have to be Mirandized if you're being arrested, because that covers your 4th your Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendment rights under the Constitution. So that's where that comes in. And the other court case that is a big court case that happened in 1963 is when they took prayer out of schools. So we do have a lot of environmental things, like I said, under the Great Society. We have the EPA, we have OSHA, those things get started. And we also have the Social Security for people who are disabled. That gets started also under the Nixon administration. Again, more legislation. So the Silent Spring was a book written about the environmental effects, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species. These are both things to, again, addressing environmental things. So the environmental thing that, like we talked about, climate change and stuff, this has been stuff that's been going on since the 60s. So we're talking over 60 years of activists talking about the climate and the environment and animals and things like that. So long before PETA and everything we have going on now, if people have been talking about this for well over 60 years. We did go off the gold standard in 1971, and Nixon had a strategy to try to get more Southern voters, involved in the political process. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973 because the president kind of went a little crazy with his war power. Even though because we never officially declared war on Vietnam, he technically did not have those powers. They were given to him by Congress under the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in the 60s, in 1964, and he abused them, and which is now we know because of the Pentagon Papers. And so Congress said, nope, you don't have those powers anymore, and rebuked him. So now the president does not have power unless we have declared war on another country, and we never declared war on North Vietnam. All right, so Nixon is most famous for the Watergate scandal. Now, his vice president resigned because he was accepting bribes and also very dirty, unfortunately. So the Watergate was a complex that the Democratic National Convention had their offices in. Well, the Nixon administration, or the committee to re-elect the president, had gone in and bugged the offices so that they could listen to what was happening. Because think about it, if you've ever had a conversation with somebody and they say something and you don't have a good response, and then later on you're like, I should have said this. Imagine you know what they're going to say in advance so you can prepare for it. That's what he was doing. He was kind of getting their playbook, so to speak. And so the Saturday Night Massacre was all these people that were associated with Watergate getting fired. And there was an informant that went to the newspaper, that went to these two guys right here, Woodward and Bernstein, and said, hey, he records all these conversations. He's got tapes of all this. He knows about, he was involved in Watergate, because Nixon was like, I had no idea. And so the Supreme Court said, we got to have the tapes. And he said, you can't have the tapes. There's matters of national security on there. You can't have them. And then he finally does give them tapes, because they're like, we got to have the tapes. And he gives them tapes that takes the stuff out that basically implicates him in the crime. And they finally said, we got to have all the tapes. And when he does, he knows he's going to be impeached over this, so he actually resigns in 1974. Gerald Ford becomes the only person in American history to be president who was not elected, because he was appointed because, again, Spiro Agnew had resigned and now Nixon had resigned. So we had no vice president or president. And one of the things that Gerald Ford did was immediately pardon Nixon for his Watergate crimes. So, again, we pull out, the last Americans leave Vietnam. We stopped fighting in 1973. Americans did. They were still fighting. We pulled the last Americans out of Vietnam, out of Saigon, in 1975. And it cost us almost $200 billion and over 56,000 casualties. So they think now it's more like about 58,000 casualties. And there is a monument to them, Vietnam and Korea, in Washington, D.C. Okay, so the Tuskegee experiment concluded in 1972, and so the Tuskegee experiment was an experiment on the people of Tuskegee, Alabama. The government basically said, we're, treating you for a sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, and they willingly took part in this. They were not treating them. They were studying them. They were studying the spread of this disease through the community in predominantly African American Tuskegee. And when everybody found out what they were doing, this caused a lot of distrust, and rightfully so, from the African American population towards the U.S. government. Title IX is started in 1972. This gives rights for female sports. So before 1972, there were no publicly funded or school-funded girls' sports. So that comes about because of Title IX. Equal Rights Amendment, it was designed to basically go along with the 14th Amendment, give more rights to women, because this was focused on women. Again, we're in the feminist movement. It did not get added to the Constitution because it failed to be ratified by enough states. Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, and I know this is a big hot topic. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a very liberal justice on the Supreme Court in the 90s and into the 2000s, the way the original argument for Roe v. Wade was written, she herself said it would not stand up to scrutiny. She was afraid that at some point, and she was for Roe v. Wade, she was afraid at some point it could easily be overthrown by the right court, by the right justices, which is what happened in, a few years ago. Now, all it did when they overturned Roe v. Wade is it gave the power back to the states. It did not say no one can have an abortion. It just simply said that we're going to let each state decide their own abortion laws. And so you did have states that had trigger laws in place, basically like if Roe v. Wade were ever overturned, laws would automatically go into effect. They wouldn't have to go past the laws. So that's why you have a lot of these very harsh laws in places like Texas with the heartbeat bill, because of these trigger laws. So Jimmy Carter is president after Gerald Ford, and we are facing a whole bunch of problems. So this is why a lot of people compare President Biden's administration to President Carter's administration, because we were facing a lot of the same problems. We had really high inflation rates. We had gas shortages. And so it was just a whole lot of problems. So again, a lot of the same stuff we've been dealing with in the last few years with high inflation rates and gas shortages. These all happened under the Carter administration as well. And we did invade. We did help the Afghan nation, Afghanistan, against Soviet invasion in 1979. And we basically, gave them, we militarized the Middle East to fight off communism. And so we caused a lot of our own problems, unfortunately, in the Middle East. And in late 1979, Iran took some American students, American embassy people in Iran hostage, and kept them hostage for 444 days. They were not released until the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in January of 1981. That is the end of the 70s.